Good evening, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's event, an evening with Lord Carlile, former Independent Reviewer of Terrorism Legislation, Michael Gove, Conservative MP and former Cabinet Member, in conversation with William Shawcross, author and Independent Reviewer of Prevent. This is the second annual public lecture from my organisation, the Counter Extremism Group. And it's great to see so many friends and supporters back from last year. It's also really lovely to see some new faces this year. And for those of you that don't know us, the Counter Extremism Group, we are a small London-based think tank founded a couple of years ago to provide practical counter-extremism policy solutions. I'm really, really delighted that we are joined this evening by such impressive speakers, especially in this eventful week and rainy evening. So thank you, and thank you all for coming. I'm sure, well, I hope they won't mind me saying that between them, Lord Carlile and Michael bring several decades worth of experience and expertise to the area of national security, counter-terrorism and extremism. Beyond their roles at the kind of legal, policy and political coalface, I think we know them as having tackled and continue to tackle the kind of thornier, bigger questions in this area, those around how liberal democratic societies can best identify and respond to the ideas that fuel and animate terrorists and extremists. And it'll be great to hear their thoughts on that this evening. I'm also really grateful that William has agreed to join us and moderate tonight's discussion. He has the unenviable task of reviewing the government's counter-terrorism preventative programme, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with and is another difficult subject. So we're really glad to be joined by him. I should also say that tonight's discussion is the flagship event of our CEG's second Young Leaders in National Security Fellowship, which is a programme running all of this week. I'm very grateful that Lord Carlile and William have agreed to head this year's fellowship, and through it we hope to identify and nurture new talent in the counter-extremism space and support people who are trying to break into the area. So it's great that so many of them are here tonight and that they can speak to more experienced members of the audience and start conversations. So just a couple of things. Tonight's event is on the record, and also if you'd like to post about it on social media, please feel free. Finally, please join me in welcoming our speakers.
Well, thank you all very much. It's a great honour for me and a great pleasure to be here speaking at this event, the CEG's National Security Fellowship Week, which is this is your second year, as you've done, which I think is a very important occasion. I met some of the fellows last year, and they were very, very able people indeed, and I look forward to seeing more of those here this year as well. And to be between Michael and Alex is quite daunting, because they are both very superior intellects in the nicest possible way. And they both have a huge amount of experience of counterterrorism and extremism, and they've both written about it at great length, and I'm a huge admirer of both of them. Alex, I only discovered this yesterday actually from Alex himself, when he was appointed the Independent Reviewer of Terrorism on the 11th of September 2001, and David Blunkett, the Home Secretary, called him and said, it's a very, very part-time job. It's almost nothing to worry about. It's just Northern Ireland, and that's getting much better all the time, as you know. This was at breakfast time on that morning, and Alex conferred with his wife and agreed that he should take the job before lunchtime. And during lunch, I think it was, the first plane hit the World Trade Center that day. So your days were, you were told it was 40 days a year, and it became 300 days a year, I think.
Well, 176 in the first year, yes.
And Michael, I've known for a very long time, and we have debated 20 years ago on these sorts of subjects. And together, usually on the same side of the platform, I'm glad to say. and he's superb, and he wrote a book about all of this back in 2006, wasn't it? Yes, called Celsius 77, which is, I think the title speaks for itself. It's a very slim but very powerful book indeed, and very important one, I think. So both of them have a lot to say, which is fortunate because I don't want to say a great deal. Hannah mentioned that my report on, I was doing a report on Prevent, and I was indeed chosen after a competition to do this, to do a review of Prevent, after Alex had started to do such a review, but for a complicated reason was unable to complete it. Not because he didn't wish to, he did wish to, but he didn't. He can explain that himself if he wishes. And I was eventually selected to take on his role, which was a very difficult shoes to fill. And I've been working on that, and it has been delivered to the Home Secretary, but I can't speak about it until it's actually accepted and published. So I'm sorry about that, but that means I can listen to them, as can you. And that's much more interesting than listening to me. Now, both of you, Michael and Alex, you've both been thinking about counter-terrorism and counter-extremism for a very long time. Could you, each of you in turn, perhaps Alex first, reflect on how far we've come in that time and how well you think we're doing? And perhaps a subsidiary question, if another organization like ISIS were to arise today, do you think we would be better equipped to deal with it than last time?
Well, as William's true story about how the day I was appointed illustrates, things can change extremely quickly. Because on that day, although we knew ISIS existed, it was not in our vision really until lunchtime that day, breakfast time in New York. My own view is that there are a lot of curmudgeonly and hostile people around who think that the security services are a bunch of hoodlums, that the police have no skill in detecting terrorism and preventing terrorism, and that the government has only an interest in suppressing freedom of speech and so on. And I think that's a very naive and unfair view, and I think that some organizations get away with repeating that view because we feel a little more embarrassed than we should be about calling them out for what they really are. I'm not in favor, actually, of unduly suppressing people saying what they want to say, but I am very much in favor of putting them in a debating chamber of some sort and taking them apart, if that's appropriate. So my view is that given the experience we've had, particularly since 9/11, which is now 21 years, we are much more ready to deal with such problems. We have a chaotically organized police service of 43 territorial police forces, but we have a much smaller number of counter-terrorism units organized on a regional basis. My view is that police forces should be organized like that now, and indeed the CTUs really do function. We have quite a number of, but not all, quite a number of very capable academics who lead thought and debate on this subject. We have a proportion of politicians who are prepared to listen fairly to the discussion, but Michael, as a member of the House of Commons, and I, as a former member of the House of Commons, know that not everybody has the same attention span in that chamber, and sometimes they are led by headlines rather than by analysis. But on the whole, I think and I've studied similar issues around the world, on the whole, we're as well prepared as any other comparable country to deal with terrorism and violent extremism. And as long as we use our flexible constitution and the institutions we have to best effect, I don't particularly worry about our capacity to deal with terrorism. I do worry about the growth of terrorism, particularly among young people who are actually not very driven by theology, but are driven by other considerations, which can, of course, include poverty and other forms of deprivation.
Can you expand on that last point a bit? Driven by other what exactly?
Well, I think people, for example, who feel that they've been marginalized because they belong to a particular part of the community are more likely to become terrorists. And if you take, I'm not talking about the United Kingdom necessarily, if you take France or Belgium as examples, there is plenty of evidence of that. I think people who have suffered bullying and other forms of abuse in their early lives are much more vulnerable. And you can see that if you analyse the personalities. Dr. Robin Simcox and Hannah Stewart have done that over the years. If you analyse their writing, particularly when they were at Henry Jackson, about the terrorists whom they were researching. So it is very much an individual thing. And of course, there's the influence of the internet, which is worth a discussion all on its own, and I'm sure it'll be raised later.
I think it should be, certainly. Michael.
Well, I agree very broadly with what Alex said. I hope it's helpful to think about the problem with extremism and terrorism by using a medical analogy. So when you have extremism that has mutated or grown or metastasized to the point where it actually becomes lethal, then at that point, the British state is actually pretty good. So when it comes to counter-terrorism policing and the work of the intelligence and in particular the security service, we are, as Alex said, amongst the strongest in the world. And if you talk to people in the United States or in Israel or in European democracies, they respect the work of MI5. They appreciate that our counter-terrorism policing is highly effective. And they acknowledge not only that the operational tools are good and the professionals are committed, but also that there's been a bit of a change over the course of the last 20 years, even in the way in which the judiciary and other aspects of the criminal justice system recognise that there are specific challenges here. So in that sense, the equivalent in counter-terrorism of our hospital service, our accident and emergency service, the work that is done, once the disease is developed, pretty good. But the problem is that the equivalent in counter-terrorism of public health, the equivalent in counter-terrorism of reducing infection and disease in the first place, we are much weaker. And that's because the analysis has been there for a long time. But people either don't pay attention, close their ears, or listen to louder voices. And this is where I take a slightly different view to the view that Alex takes. Alex is right that there are some people, just like in health, who are more vulnerable to infection with the virus of extremism. So it is the case that if there are people who have had certain traumas when they've grown up, who have a greater propensity towards mental health problems, who may have dabbled in drugs, they are themselves slightly more fragile and slightly more susceptible, not just to extremism, but also to crime. However, the virus itself, let's be clear about this. I mean, there are two, essentially. We can talk about some others in a moment. Are Islamism and an extreme right-wing, white nationalist, identitarian politics. And these are ideologies and they feed off each other. Islamism is by far the greater threat. I don't dismiss the identitarian threat for a moment, particularly strong in America and in parts of Europe, slightly less so here. But the Islamist threat is the most profound one. And just as a trained doctor can tell you the difference between a pneumonia or a meningitis infection, so there are people in this room and beyond who can tell you exactly what Islamism is. It is not conservative religious Islam. There are people, we will all know them, who might have religious views with which we disagree, who would bring up their children in ways that we wouldn't necessarily want to see our children brought up. But the good British citizens, and just because they have a different take on their religion, then in Britain we should respect that. But separate from them are people who believe in political Islam. And political Islam is recognizable in the same way as a doctor can recognize the symptoms of a particular disease. There are thinkers, Hassan al-Banna, Said Qutb, who are the Maududi, who are the progenitors of it. There is a shared belief that essentially Islam has been in retreat for at least 100 years, almost exactly 100 years since the demise of the Ottoman Empire and the destruction of the Caliphate, and that Islam's failure was as a result of a failure essentially to apply itself with a degree of both doctrinal purity but also political vigor. And the aim of political Islamists everywhere is to replace the system of democracy and liberal democracy, and indeed to replace nation states, even though they may contest elections in some places, others don't, with the House of Islam, against which is the House of War. The name is revealing. Now, there are some Islamists, political Islamists, who dislike the idea of violence and might never contemplate it. But it is their ideology that provides the shield and the sword for those who do believe that violence can be justified, even if they don't necessarily perpetrate it themselves. And these arguments have been made for at least 2 decades in Whitehall. But there has been resistance to them. And the resistance has come from a variety of different sources. One, there are people who just don't want to do the work. Secondly, there are people who think as soon as you mention the word Islam, even if you then go on instantly to qualify the difference between Islam as a religion that nurtures and provides wonderful support for millions across the world and political Islam, even as you draw that important distinction, they think you're already treading into territory where you are Islamophobic and therefore racist and therefore illiberal. And then the third thing is that there are some people, including some very smart people still within the sort of British security apparatus, who think all this stuff about ideology in a conveyor belt is wrong. And their view has been characterized, perhaps unfairly, as believing that you don't drain the swamp, you just wait until the crocodile gets close to the boat. You know, it's really important to make sure that you do have that hard national security infrastructure, which Alex has quite rightly praised, but the work of dealing with extremism, and that is why that failure to pay attention, that desire not to cause offence, and that belief that ultimately when you're dealing with extremism, it's only violent extremism that you should worry about, all of those things mean that the prevent strategy that has been put forward and has been widely criticised is being criticised for the wrong reasons. It's being criticised as somehow an attempt to restrict freedom of expression and belief. Not at all. The right way to criticise prevent is that it has been ineptly and inefficiently distributed so that people in the civil service and elsewhere haven't had the guidebook, haven't had the toolbook, haven't had the Gray's Anatomy, as it were, to know which organisations to support and which not to. So that means that organisations which are actively opposed to liberal democratic values have been in receipt of British government money because that analysis has not been undertaken. And that, I think, is the particular challenge. Now, again, not everyone, as you can tell, who's been in government shares my view, but I challenge anyone to argue that the ideology of Islamism, however defined, has not been the driving force behind these acts of violence. Of course, it preys on particular types of people in particular types of way. And the other challenge as well is, when people say, what do you mean by Islamism? I think it is moral and intellectual delinquency to deny its existence when there are Islamists there who are out and proud, whose language, ideology, way of seeing the world is there for all to see, and who would be more than happy to make the case, indeed as they do make the case, on any platform they're given.
How do you think that reticence or that reluctance to accept this, your definition and your explanation of the dangers of political Islam and non-violent political Islam also, how do you think that people can be persuaded of your point of view, and why is it taking them so long?
Well, I think the reasons that I mentioned, I think there may be other reasons as well. As I say, I think one of them is too difficult. One of them is dangerously close to racism. This is a conveyor belt to prejudice and dividing society. The third thing has been just institutional rollover, different ministers responsible for it, and people never getting a proper grip. But I think the fourth thing as well, there's one other thing which is linked to the second, is that there's been strong pushback. So if you do make this case on a public platform, then you can be absolutely certain not just that Islamists, but that others will attack you. So my friend Melanie Phillips, with whom I disagree on a lot, whenever she's made this argument, has been characterized as an Islamophobe. I was called an Islamophobe by the very distinguished historian Willie Dalrymple, and he repeats it at every point. You know, even when he agreed with a couple of things I did at the MOJ, he said, well, for an Islamophobe, at least Michael Gove, ... You know, it was consistent. Now, I know I'm not, for 101 reasons. But for lots of other people, you know, that is a boo word, which means, oh, right, okay, I'm going to retreat from public debate. I don't want to have that. And it is much easier to have an argument about economics, where I might take a slightly different view, but no one's going to think that I'm immoral, than to get involved in this space. And again, I don't want to be unduly pessimistic. There have been politicians who have been very good on this. So, David Cameron originally started out in opposition, being very concerned that Islamist, because of the first two syllables in that description, was not a phrase you should use. But he did the work and study. He gave a marvellous speech at the Munich Security Conference. His recent public pronouncements on the policy exchange platform and so on have shown that he absolutely gets it. I was very lucky that there were ministers with whom I was working in DLUC, in the Levelling Up Department, who got it. I'm very lucky that there are people like Rt Hon, the extremism advisor to government, very skilled and brave and honest and hard-working public servant who got it. There were people who were working in 10 Downing Street until very recently who got it, but not enough. And that's been part of the challenge, I think.
Yeah, I see that. Do you want to add anything to that, Alex?
Yeah, I mean, I come at this in a slightly different way because I'm actually at heart and at mind a lawyer. And, you know, I'm, for this purpose, a criminal lawyer. And my determination is that the criminal law should protect the public and therefore enable the government to carry out its primary duty that the public should be and feel safe in this country. So my starting point is to have a good definition of terrorism, which we have, as good as any in the world, and to be in a position to enforce the law against people who are terrorists. So that's the legal position. Now, why do people commit these acts? Well, I've done hundreds of murder cases, literally. And people commit murder for all kinds of reasons. They may commit murder because they're flat earthers, so I've never actually found that one. But nothing in a criminal court ever surprises me. And when one is looking at terrorism offences, the sorts of background that Michael has been referring to are evidential. They're part of the key analysis of the law enforcement, which the lawyer, the judge, the director of public prosecutions, the attorney general are going to enforce. So I try to separate what happens in the courtroom or in the police station from the motive forces, whilst using those motive forces as key learning. And I think that works on the whole.
Good. Going back to the notion of Islamophobia, which I agree has become a very, very powerful threat to people in a way, the way you feel threatened by proposing things for which you're accused of Islamophobia. Can I just read you both, and all of you, the definition of Islamophobia, which was adopted by the All-Parliamentary Group on Islam some years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expression of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. I wonder what either of you think of that.
I think it's drivel, frankly. And not only do I think it's drivel, but I think it's highly undesirable to try and provide a prescriptive definition of either Islamophobia or extremism. I'm not against definitions, and I'm not against the sort of definitions that say extremism shall include. But the forms of extremism I have observed in only 23 years, they've changed. You know, we didn't have the same level, at least, of right-wing extremism, though I share your view completely, Michael, about the proportionality of right-wing extremism in relation to Islamist violence, Islamist extremism. So, you know, I think if we're going to go for definitions, let's make sure that they can be living instruments and not that they limit the scope and effectiveness of the law.
I completely agree with Alex, and I'm just going to say a couple of other things. It doesn't much matter what I believe, but as it happens, I'm a fairly conventional, what's the word?
We're trying.
fairly conventional, bad, whatever. I'm not trying to make any claims, but whatever.
Scotsman
Church of
was the
Scotland.
word you were
Church
looking
of
for.
Scotland. And I therefore think, in general, our society is enriched the more people who have faith. Absolutely. However, one of the things I think about that definition is that people who I've hugely admired in the past and admire warily now, like Chris Hitchens and Richard Dawkins, would be caught by that. Yeah. And that would be totally wrong. Totally wrong.
Douglas Murray would also be caught by it.
Exactly. Completely inappropriate. And the second thing is exactly as Alex says, things change. So I think it would be very difficult. We can try. It would be very difficult to get a precise definition, which would then have, the force of law for what right-wing identitarian politics might involve, because it changes. Because there are other examples of extremism towards which the state has to be vigilant. Not banning things online, but vigilant. So there is an overlap between right-wing identitarian terrorism and extremism and ideology, and some of the anti-vax movements. Again, perfectly legitimate for people to have concerns about vaccination, but you know what I mean. And similarly, the incel and other movements. There are groups of people online who, again, because of some of the factors that Alex has mentioned in their personality and upbringing, are susceptible to types of extremism. Again, the numbers are small, but we have to be realistic about dealing with them. And as these sorts of manifestations of extremism or antisocial behavior or threats in some cases to the peace and security of individuals arise, we do need to be vigilant. And my argument is for not rigid definition, but a greater degree of precision. And again, I'm not a doctor, but it's a bit like medicine. You know that there are some viruses out there that are lethal and many people can catch, and then there are new viruses which, again, are much less, either at the moment potentially less virulent, certainly at the moment less widespread, but you do need to be aware of how we can effectively deal with them should they become bigger threats.
Still on definitions, if I may. In 2005, when I was independent reviewer, the government asked me to review the definition of terrorism in English law. So I set about it, and one of the first places I went was to the United Nations in New York, because I was told there was a committee in the United Nations which was seeking to produce a definition of terrorism. And I met them. In 2005, when I met them, they had been trying to produce this definition for 25 years. They're still trying. And the part definition that they produced was 105 phrases, which I think were produced by 105 different academics. And it's just an illustration of how dangerous it is, or just plain silly, to go down this road when there are much better ways of legislating.
Well, I completely understand that, and I agree with you, but I think I'm right in saying that this definition created by the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Islam has been accepted by every party except the Conservative Party, every party in Parliament, and by scores of councils across the country. So it's maybe drivel, but it's drivel that's getting quite wide reach. And what do you think, if anything, one should do about drivel being circulated in this way? Is there anything one can do about it, or is it part of a free society that you can't do anything?
I think organisations can say that they accept this definition, but I think there are dangers, aren't there?
Yes.
If a university or another organisation, which should be the home of free inquiry and free debate, then uses a definition like that to police what people can say and to penalise them for it. I mean, there's a broader debate to be had about what is happening on some campuses and the sorts of views that are silenced or censored or marginalised, and those which are given a greater degree of prominence and accepted unquestioningly as orthodoxy. But on that specific question, I think the right thing to do, as Alex said right at the very beginning, is to challenge it respectfully in debate, bring knowledge to bear, and then if there are people who do have important things to say, or even if they're trivial things to say, but they're honestly and fairly and decently expressed, then to push back against these restrictions.
Alex, yes? Well, would you agree with that?
As Michael was thinking, I was actually thinking of a place I visited this year, which was the cathedral in Salamanca, the great university city in Spain, which is massive and must have cost an absolute fortune to build. and is in itself a definition of the belief in the period of a few decades in which it was built. And now it's just a redundant place of beauty to many, in many ways. And I think, when we try to write definitions which have a sort of monumental aspect to them and which are delivered as being the last word in the perfect architecture of the language, we're making trouble for ourselves. And I think, there are representatives here of some very distinguished third sector organisations. I won't mention them by name, and I'm looking straight at one of them. I think they have demonstrated the need to be flexible and to use normal social approaches to persuading people, community approaches to persuading people that what they're thinking may just be wrong and dangerous.
Okay, I think perhaps we could move out of that or onto that to the principle of free expression and freedom of thought, because it's really, really important. It is, as Michael says, under threat from very, very different areas now, ones that many of us would never have expected only 2 or 3 years ago. But one of the things that has come up now recently is, or in terms of extremism and counter-extremism, is blasphemy. The charge of blasphemy really does seem to be in danger of limiting free expression. The recent attack, the horrific attack on Salman Rushdie, is something that is another example of the fact that we haven't got to grips with it. Here in the UK, we've had a teacher go into hiding, a shopkeeper in Glasgow murdered, a Christian preacher knifed at Speaker's Corner, and a Shia film, pulled from cinemas at the demands of protesters, mostly Muslim protesters, I think it has to be said. What needs to be done about free expression in terms of our debate and our concerns about extremism and indeed terrorism, because some of these attacks were indeed terroristic? And how do we deal with the charge of blasphemy? And how do we stop it having a veto on free expression? Alex?
Well, I'm going to take shelter again in being a lawyer. My own view is that people, first of all, they have the right to think what they want to think. We can't do anything about what they think except provide a better education system. In my view, if they say things that are criminal in their purpose or effect, if they incite people to violence, if they conspire to commit violence, then absolutely rightly they should be dealt with by the law. And if what they say, for example, glorifies terrorism and thereby is a criminal offence now, so be it. However, I think taking simple concepts like, I don't like a particular religion, it is absolutely undesirable to criminalise that sort of language. Most criticism of religious groups or of any other group, a racial group, can be seen off in debate. I think there is a responsibility on those who are able to control debate, like the broadcasters and the newspapers, to ensure that the debate is fair. And even the BBC is not always fair in the way in which it deals with debate. For example, in relation to anti-Semitism, there have been 1 or 2 incidents recently in which the BBC gave a platform to some very undesirable, bordering criminal views, and there was no response to it. But I don't think we should be frightened of people saying uncomfortable and nasty things if they're not criminal, because actually we can see them off.
Michael?
Yes, and I don't agree. I mean, when people talk about blasphemy, sometimes the phrase "God is not mocked" is used. But when people do use it, it is misused, just as often as calling the House of Commons the mother of parliaments is misused. We all know, everyone in this room knows, that it is England that is the mother of parliaments. In the same way, I'm sure everyone in this room knows that when you say God is not mocked, it doesn't mean you should not mock God. It means God, omnipotent and endlessly kind and generous, rises above the mockery of human beings and takes that suffering on his shoulders. So, the truth is that blasphemy should not be tolerated. Sorry, attempts to restrict freedom of speech by invoking some form of blasphemy, or talking about the tender feelings of believers, should not be indulged in a society like ours. And therefore, when there were protests against a particular film, which was, for many people, genuinely offensive, well, in Britain, you don't police artistic expression in that way. You or I might think it was pathetic or disgusting or foolish or silly, but you don't try to put pressure on those who are running cinemas or theatres to close that down. That's wrong. Similarly, I mentioned Christopher Hitchens earlier. All of us, I think, will have been devastated by the attack on Salman Rushdie earlier. I'm just going to mention two things as a result of that. One is that in the immediate aftermath, newspapers like the New York Times said, the motive of the attacker is obscure. You didn't need to be a QC with the forensic skills of Alex to discern what the motive might have been. But
newspapers are still using that phrase.
The second thing linked to that is that in the immediate aftermath, some of you may have seen a clip from Christopher Hitchens on Question Time. He was on with his brother Peter and Shirley Williams, Baroness Williams. Great figure, Baroness Williams, in many ways. However, the question was asked, should Salman Rushdie have been given a knighthood at a particular moment? And Shirley Williams, as a liberal Democrat, said, oh no, I thought the timing was wrong, and it was sort of dangerous and offensive. And then Chris Hitchens explained why he thought that was completely wrong. The thing is that you cannot give in on something like that. We might all have different views about the literary merits of Salman Rushdie's work. We might think that it was perhaps ungallant of him or rude of him to write a novel which might cause offence in that way. But free speech means nothing if it doesn't include the freedom to offend. And once we start giving an inch to people who say, well, then where does that lead us? And, there is an attempt, and a successful one, to restrict freedom of speech in this country and in Europe. You may again remember Jyllands-Posten, the Dutch newspaper that published certain cartoons. Those cartoons have not been, except with one title, republished in the UK because of the fear of what that would mean for people working in an organisation where they're published. So, in effect, what we have is a live threat. If you transgress certain boundaries of expression, violence will follow. And for anyone who doubts that, the horrific attack on Salman Rushdie was another reminder that this is not simply rhetorical. And that is why I think that we need to do everything possible to stress that the virtues that allow people in this country to worship in the way that they wish and to love God in the way that they wish, those virtues depend upon freedom of speech, and that involves us being able to say that we will push back against those who are attempting to restrict it, and that certainly we acknowledge the offence, but we're not going to apologise for other people using their creative power to explain what they think and feel.
But, Michael, we're not pushing back, are we? The film was stopped, the sheer film was stopped in cinemas from being shown. The distributors withdrew it for that very fear that you have described.
Completely, but at least, I say at least, they did. And it's another example of that concern. But there were very powerful voices, Sarah Collins in particular, but very powerful voices that stressed that if we carry on like this, then we're sunk. I overstate it. If we carry on like this, then it's an unhappy consequence. And again, to be fair, it's not restricted just to some Islamic groups. It is also the case that I think the play was called Beheshti, was closed down in Birmingham because it gave offence to a particular subset of British Sikhs. And again, I have absolutely no desire to discommode people on the basis of their faith and beliefs, but the reason that this country has been, and I pray it continues to be, such a warm home to so many different people of all faiths and none, is because we do not allow crowds to close, or we should not allow crowds to close and to shut down free expression.
No. I mean, do you think that in this country, there's lots of things that have done wonderfully in this country. Do you think we should be more robust in some ways? When Samuel Paty, the French teacher, was beheaded for showing his class some of the Mohammed cartoons by a Chechen extremist who'd flown into Paris precisely to do that, Macron gave him a state funeral. When a teacher in Batley showed his class similar cartoons, he, thank God, was not killed, but Islamist protesters came to the school and terrorized him and the school, and he has gone into hiding. His life has been irreparably changed. What can we do about those sorts of things? And was Macron right to make such an example of Samuel Paty?
I do, and I think there are some things that I disagree with Emmanuel Macron on. Don't think he loses any sleep over that, if indeed he's ever heard of me. However, when it comes to dealing with these questions, I'm full of admiration. Now, there's traditional French approach in Republican virtue, laïcité, the separation of state and church, which is different from this country, different history, different precedents. But nevertheless, Emmanuel Macron has been incredibly robust in calling out Islamism, and anyone who has seen what he's said will know the very clear distinctions that he's drawn and the careful lines that he's drawn as well. Yeah. And I think that was absolutely the right thing to do.
As a lawyer?
I just think we should beware of overreaction.
I think, well, on that, I think we've talked quite a lot between ourselves. I think we should throw it open to the floor. Now, can we have a mic going round?
One of our students.
There's someone in the front row here is one of your students, I think, so we'd like to speak. And then we'll go more widely ranging.
Thank you. No, I was just... I did, yeah, sorry. I think it's on. Yeah. It's more of a question to Mr. Gove. So you said that you should deal with sort of issues of extremism with precision without sort of strengthening the definition. But how can you sort of be more precise in your sort of counter-extremism efforts without solidifying a definition to actually go on?
Yeah. No, I think it's a very, very good point. And even as I was talking about Islamophobia, I anticipated this question coming. I think what you can't do is to fossilize a definition which seeks to restrict free expression and free debate. But what you can do is you can better equip people in the public square and all of us to understand and therefore to take on the ideology that faces us. So I do not believe that there is 1 in 1,000 people in the civil service who would know about Hassan al-Banna, Said Qutb, Maulana Maududi, and so on. And that is not a criticism of them, it's a criticism of me. Because if you were dealing with Islamist extremism, which can manifest itself in bids for nursery contracts, through to how people, as we know, have tried to solicit money from Prevent, being aware of what Islamist organizations say and do is critical to that. And again, in my time as Education Secretary, we had a big problem in Birmingham, the Trojan Horse affair. Had we had a better understanding from the off of the sorts of things that constitute political Islam, the sorts of ideas and the sorts of networks, then we would have been in a stronger position to nip that in the bud. That wouldn't have meant, at that stage, arresting anyone, but it would have meant that in the application of public policy, a certain wariness and vigilance would have been embedded earlier. And we do it in different ways. So, when government is thinking about who gets grants or who gets access to ministers, there is a certain amount of due diligence that goes on. Absolutely. That's not denying anyone their right. It's being appropriate in allocating time and money within government. But while that due diligence may go on in order to see if someone has perhaps posted a tweet that is on the wrong line of the debate on gender politics, far less work, because the tools don't exist and the knowledge hasn't been disseminated effectively, goes on in dealing with these questions.
Yes, there's somebody right at the back. We'll come to you in a minute. Oh, right, okay.
Hello.
Okay.
Obviously, we've got a new government today, and extremism hasn't been an issue in the leadership debate. It seems to have fallen off the government's radar and the public radar to a degree. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on why that might be and whether you had any ideas of what you would like to see the new government do.
Michael, but I just one slight correction. I think that Rishi Sunak made at least one long reference to prevent, if not two. Michael.
I think, just generally, I think everyone in this room is interested and cares deeply about the subject. I think it's just in the nature of the political leadership debate, particularly one mediated through the media we have, that and the cost of living crisis. The urgent takes precedent over the. I'm not saying cost of living isn't important, but the urgent and important takes precedence over other things which are important but not necessarily seen as urgent. I think that's the first thing. So it's just the nature of the debate. The second thing is, I do know that in some of the questions we've been discussing about free speech, Liz and Rishi, as it happens, are as one, and Liz is very no nonsense in her approach towards what she regards as people attempting to close down free expression behind a cloak of supposed virtue. So I think Liz will be, as she is in almost every area, if not every area, robust. But I do think that what we need to do is to make sure that the debate remains informed. And there will be a key test for the new government. And that test will be how they respond to William's report. It's not that I think that they should necessarily implement every one of the recommendations, because I haven't read it. But my view will be, if they treat William's report with seriousness, and they respond with seriousness, that shows that they appreciate the vital importance of this question. If it is kicked into the long grass, diluted, doesn't see the light of day, if the government response is 2 pages published on a Friday afternoon, that would be a worry.
If I could answer that question, I think that the competitors for the leadership of the Conservative Party were very sensible to largely keep away from these issues, because I don't think they would have had anything distinctive to offer on it anyway. And indeed, what I think is extremely important is that these issues should be dealt with in as bipartisan a way as is humanly possible. And if you look at what Sir Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper have said about the subject, you would find that you might just about get a piece of paper between their views and the Conservative Party's views when it comes to action, though possibly not rhetoric.
Yeah. And to be fair, there have been some people in the Labour Party. I mentioned, I'm not sure if I mentioned all of them earlier, but there have been people like Hazel Blears and her special advisor Paul Richards when they were in government, who took this issue incredibly seriously. Blair himself, and again, some of the work that his institute has done on this has been excellent. And that, there are Labour backbenchers like Kelly Mahmood who've been very brave in...
Charles Clarke.
Exactly, yes. Yes.
Hi, sorry.
Can we... Somebody could perhaps turn the...
Right.
Okay. Yes, we should.
Sorry, quite right too.
And then Jonathan Hall.
Yeah. Sorry, Duncan Gardam, speaking right from the back. I'm going to ask Michael. You've been speaking extremely passionately this evening. You've stepped back from frontline politics. We've heard somebody else this morning saying they may return. How long do you think you're going to stay away from frontline politics? And is there any more you can tell us about why you stepped back?
Well, it's very good. The thing is that it's not really within my power. We have a new Prime Minister, and she's choosing her government at the moment with lots of talented people in it. And no, I have an opportunity now to do some other things, and I don't think there's anything I've said so far this evening that I probably wouldn't have said to this audience if I had still been a minister. Maybe the bit about the vital importance of implementing William's, or not implementing necessarily, responding appropriately to William's report. As I say, maybe, I don't know that William says things with which I disagree. It hasn't happened for a long time, but it is possible. So that was it. And you've got to give a new Prime Minister the opportunity to set the agenda, and Liz won a handsome victory, and I can do other things.
Well, we look forward to seeing them and hearing them and reading.
Reading
Yes,
them, yeah.
with this young man here.
Thank you. Hugo Williams. My question is for both Lord Carlile and Mr. Gove. I'd like to borrow Mr. Gove's medical metaphor. Given how good the UK is at treating the virus once it's metastasized, does this buy us slack to err on the side of caution when it comes to side effects of earlier interventions? So when it comes to criticisms of programs like Prevent for being partisan, politically partisan or theologically partisan or for suppressing free speech, should we, because we can, err on the side of caution?
Michael.
Yes, I think so. If I take, it's a very good question, if I infer properly from it in terms of erring on the side of caution, I think your point is, okay, we're very good at dealing with the full-blown disease, but that shouldn't exempt us from the need to try to minimise the risks, earlier. And I do take that view. So I use the metaphor which had been used by others before about draining the swamp or beating back the crocodiles when they reach the boat. I'm pro draining the swamp. The police and MI5 do a brilliant job, but I wouldn't want to be, famous say 1984, Brighton bombing, IRA say you were lucky today to Margaret Thatcher, we only need to be lucky once. I would not want to be in a situation where an already overstretched police and an already hard-working security service were placed under greater strain, so I think we should do it. But even without that, there's another broader thing as well, which is that policy rightly implemented helps in all sorts of other areas as well. So when it comes to education, schools and higher education, when it comes to other areas of the criminal justice system, when it comes to free speech and community cohesion, however defined, the better we understand extremism, the easier it is for all of those institutions in our society to function in a healthy way. So I don't think it's either or. I think you need both in order to have society functioning as well as it could.
Thank you. Alex.
Yeah, I'm not sure what you mean by erring on the side of caution. If caution means that you run the risk of more people being murdered by Usman Khan at Fishmongers Hall, then no, one should not err on the side of caution. If caution means you should avoid unnecessarily arresting people and putting them in custody, then yes, I think one should err on the side of caution. So I would use different words, if you'll forgive the pedantry. I think I would err on the side of proportionality and justice. And those are words which are much easier to test, both politically and judicially.
Good. Jonathan Hall.
So I'm Jonathan Hall. I'm Alex's successor as Independent Reviewer of Terrorism Legislation.
But three.
I was going to ask, given the assembled sort of venerable experience of the whole panel, for a bit of historical perspective, I was looking at the Global Peace Index, which says how many deaths are caused by terrorism around the world. In 2021, there are 4 groups that dominate: Al-Qaeda, Islamic State, Taliban, and Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam. Now, are you not looking at it from the wrong end of the perspective? It's not so much the ideology, but it's the fact that you have groups who are attached to it. And I think this may explain a paradox which I'm constantly trying to work out. Why is it there's a lot of right-wing terrorism at the moment, but the lethality of right-wing terrorism is left? And I'm beginning to think that maybe the answer is that things are more lethal when they're connected to groups. Now, going back to the historical question, at the moment we have these Islamist terrorist groups. In Italy, there was the Red Army faction, and the Red Brigades in Italy or Germany may have muddled up. So as a matter of historical perspective, is it really so much going after the ideology, or isn't it really that you have to go after the groups? And at the moment, the current flavour of the dangerous groups happens to be Islamism, but in 10 years, 15, 30 years' time, it could be a different set of groups and therefore a different ideology.
Well, despite the use of the word venerable, and he used to be in my chambers, I will answer your question, Jonathan. I think the point you're making is a very good one. If you take Afghanistan as an example, the behavior of the Taliban in Afghanistan has created a breeding ground for more and more terrorists. Afghanistan has there's plenty of evidence that Afghanistan has reverted to being a place where terrorists can train and develop for international terrorism with more or less impunity, despite the fact that one group of the Taliban, which is deeply divided, would like to kill the lot of them. So I think it is actually very important to look at the causes and the political nature of the society in which those causes are developed, and to try and use diplomacy, often the diplomacy of third countries. The Qatar would be an example with Afghanistan, where Qatar has significant influence, to try and ensure that appropriate measures are taken in theatre before they leave their theatre and come to Europe.
But is that likely? That Qatar would do any such thing?
Well, I mean, Qatar has tried. It's not likely that Qatar will be hugely effective because the Taliban government has rejected Qatar's help now to a great extent, despite the fact that Qatar repaired the airport and so on.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Michael?
Yeah, very, very good question. I'd say three things. The first thing is, to wheel out my now tired medical analogy, you're right, but in the same way as people in poor housing are more likely to get respiratory diseases, and that is a common feature, simply tackling housing is not the only way to deal with respiratory infection. So there are certain features which can be more prominent in certain circumstances, but you've got to look at the totality, and I think you can't take ideology out of it. And that takes me to my next point, which is propaganda of the deed and the reason why people commit to terrorism, which is they want not only to kill their enemies and to make their enemy act in a much more repressive fashion so they can then polarize debate, they also want to inspire. Look, we're willing to do everything for this. You know, we really believe it. You could be part of an exalted elite. I mean, that was as true of the Sturmabteilung in 1933 as it is of Al-Qaeda now. And that takes me to the third point. You're absolutely right that if you've got a wicked ideology allied to organized state power, horrific, Nazi Germany. But you can't take the ideology out of it. So I'll just give you one historic example. Late 1944 in Hungary, Admiral Horthy's regime fell. Admiral Horthy was a classic authoritarian nationalist who was allied with the Axis. Pretty horrible regime. But it fell as the Russians were advancing, and it was replaced by an even more right-wing regime, the Arrow Cross. So they say we are the defenders of Hungarian nationalism. Now you might think, with the Red Army at the gates, that they would be mobilizing people in order to defeat the Bolshevik menace. Logical thing to do. You know, your country's about to be invaded, try and defend it. No. The Arrow Cross's priority was to accelerate the mass murder of remaining Jewish citizens in Hungary. Mad. Only intelligible if you understand their ideology, which is that whatever the danger from Bolshevism, Judeo-Bolshevism, the Jewish people, and a variety of other things, is a greater danger. So it is not the be-all and end-all, but I think historic evidence tells us that you can't appreciate the motives of terrorism without understanding the ideology behind it.
Jonathan, can I ask you to say one more thing about the groups and individuals? You've had a lot of experience of prisons, haven't you?
Yeah.
Can you tell the audience a bit about that and what conclusions you've led to there?
Yeah, I mean, my conclusions on the prison front was that what really matters, Parche, what Michael's got to say, is not the ideology, but the organisation of Islamist groups. So,
absolutely,
for reasons that I still find totally bizarre, if you are a terrorist killer, you will rise to the top of the hierarchy within the prison, and you will then start to disseminate your ideology down. Now, I suppose where I slightly divide from what you're saying, yes, the ideology is ultra important, but the sine qua non is a degree of organisation within the prison. And so my own recommendations, which I think have been accepted by the government, is go for the organisation. Don't have big ideological debates with prisoners, but stop them if they try and exert power over the wing.
But there is so much to say. But the key thing there is that you are right, but because the ideology of Islamism has been seen to win in Afghanistan with the Taliban, because it's been in power since 1979 in Iran, it is intrinsically more powerful. There is, thank God, no extreme right-wing, white power, racial, political organisation of force, and certainly no state.
No totalitarian.
Behind that. And then the other thing in prisons is you are right. The more, and it is true actually, as we both know, in different ways. You know, within reason, the tougher a customer you are in a poorly run prison, the more you can exert control over other prisoners and over the institution. There is a separate argument about how prisons should be run, whether they're terrorists or OCGs or whatever, attempting to run them within them. But again, I think part of the challenge there is that Islamist groups can change. And so you need to be able to determine if Al-Mujahideen changes its name, what are the common features and the common... But I know you know this story.
Can I just illustrate something of what Jonathan Hall said? At the Usman Khan inquest, there was evidence that Friday prayers in the prison in which he was held divided into two groups in the same room. One group was a perfectly good, an imam of great goodwill who conducted Friday prayers, but he could not control the other group in the room, which was the radical group. And also in cells, Sharia courts were meeting, and they were meting out floggings as a result of their judgments in the prison. And one of the adjunct staff in the prison, not a prison officer, told me that actually if they had asked the prison officers what was happening with those prisoners, they would have told them, and Usman Khan would never have been released to do what he did. So, you know, Jonathan has bravely highlighted some important issues in the prison, but what I've told you just gives a stark illustration of how serious the problem is. And I think separation units have a role in this. When we had the much maligned 90 days detention and people could be held, this was, you know, we've learned as we go along, it was overruled by the Supreme Court, but until 2005, people could be detained without charge on suspicion of terrorism. And they were some of them were put into a separate unit in a prison in Milton Keynes. And I visited it. And it was a much more felicitous atmosphere. They were happier. They were able to congregate together. They were able to exchange their views. And actually, it calmed them down a great deal. And the same sort of phenomenon occurred in the Maze prison in Belfast, some of whose worst terrorists have become pretty good Democrats on the whole. It's distasteful sometimes to say so, but they have been pretty effective as democratic politicians, having been through the discipline of that separation process.
Listen, we've come to the end of our time, I think, but there's one lady in the front here who's been asking to ask a question for a long time. Then I must wrap it up.
Thanks a lot. I was recruited to a political Islamist group when I was at university. I was in there for 10 years. And as a result of that experience, I'm going to tie your medical analogy, you have to know the disease in order to, defeat it and to challenge it and deal with it. What I'm doing now with that experience is doing very much what you were saying before that you're not very good at, is looking at why does this start? And you've mentioned that it was vulnerabilities. Because all extremist groups, they target vulnerabilities. And if we do not help people with vulnerabilities who have mental health problems, who are susceptible to radical views, we're not going to get anywhere. So we are targeting and helping people with vulnerabilities to make sure that they don't we're there to give them the support they need before extremist groups get there. Secondly, again, analogy, but I also use medical analogies, inoculation. That comes in the form of awareness in schools. So we go into schools, and you have to show the kids this is what extremist groups are going to do. They're going to, catch you online. They're going to, invite you along. They're going to make you feel good if you're feeling bullied. They're going to talk about Islamophobia and say these are the issues, you are neglected. All of those things. So in schools, I think it's vital to do the inoculation part within the schools so that, you know, when they see these things online or in their community, they can detect it and think, oh my God, these, you know, I'm staying well clear. Because when I was a political Islamist, a non-violent one, the way in which I was defeated was the Muslim community themselves saying, get out. You do not belong here. You are not part of our community. And on a good note, we have sorry, I don't know why I'm shaking so much. The Newham school in Azhar Academy is an all-girls school, and they are asking people like myself to say, come along and teach our girls. We've seen what happened to Shamima Begum. We do not want this to happen again. And they are open arms asking us to inoculate their kids so they know what's going on. And then they went that step further and said, you can only come into the school if the parents are also given this training. So there's a lot of proactivity that's happening within the Muslim community. I don't think they want to feel targeted, but people like, you know, like myself who've got experiences working with girls who are trying to join ISIS, all of that stuff, we are building a trust. So the things that Sarah Khan is doing, you know, we need more of that happening.
Thank you. That was very important and interesting.
Brilliant. Well, can I just ask, which was the group? Was it Hizb ut-Tahrir?
Yes.
Yeah.
Ah, yes.
But thank you so much for what you said. I mean, I thought it was so brave, and I agree with you completely.
Hizb ut-Tahrir pretended for a long time to be a sort of political party. And they came to see me once. I remember it vividly because it occurred in an unusual place. But they came to see me, and they told me that they were nothing worse than a political party. So I said to them, so what's your address? And they said, it's P.O. Box 36, something like that. So I said, no. If I want to come to a meeting with you, where do I go? Oh, we don't release that kind of information. Well, do you put meetings? Those are the characteristics of a terrorist. Very insidious. Yes, I agree. A very brave statement, if I may say so. Thank you.
Anyway, thank you very much. I think it's a wonderful note to end the evening on, and I thank you all for listening to us, and I thank above all our two speakers who've been superb.
Well, thank you. Thank you.